is based in Gujaranwala, right in the heart of Punjab, and it's also the center of Pakistan. We have a very strong language center, which is offering not only the national languages, but international languages as well. Our partner universities from Russia, Germany, Turkey, Malaysia, and other countries, they are offering directly from their, by the native speakers, all these languages online. And also we have a very strong network of national languages like Punjabi, Pashto, Urdu. We are offering to the international candidates as well as nationals. Now we have initiated another department within the language center, which is focused on language research, language sciences as well. Other than the language center, we have very strong and a large department of linguistics, which is working in the language science areas. Now we have started working on the language documentation along with the documentation of the culture. Because Pakistan, if we look at it, it is the home of more or less 37 languages, along with the numerous dialects, which all are endangered in next 50 to 100 years, if we look at them. And language is the carrier of culture. When language dies, culture dies. So we have started working on these projects, and we have on our panel renowned linguists from Pakistan and from our partner universities, and we are just designing from where to start and how to start. We have just started working on the language documentation project, and we welcome new members on panel. I'm very much thankful to Turab and his society for their support as well. Yeah, this is so far about our language center and our prospects, future prospects, what we are looking for language sciences.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sama, for introducing your forum. Now let me introduce our keynote speaker for today's webinar. First of all, let me thank her, despite her busy routine and activities. She showed her willingness to give us a web talk and provide us certain insights on linguistic diversity, importance of regional languages, importance of our own languages. And I'm also thankful to all the participants who have joined us from different parts of the world. Now let me introduce her. After receiving her PhD degree from Yale University in 1968, Sara taught Slavic linguistics at Yale from 1968 to 1971, and then general linguistics at the University of Pittsburgh from 1972 to 1998. Since 1999, she has been at the University of Michigan, where she is now the Bernard Bloch Distinguished University Professor of Linguistics. She was the chair of the Linguistics Department from 2010 to 2013. She had worked with elders at the Salish and Pendural Culture Committee in St. Ignatius, Montana since 1981, compiling a dictionary and other materials for the tribe's Salish Pendural language program. Her current research focuses on contact-induced language change, endangered languages, and Salesian linguistics, but she also has a continuing interest in debunking linguistic pseudoscience. A few of her publications are Language Contextualization and Genetic Linguistics with Terence Kaufman, University of California Press, 1988 and 1991. Language Contact and Introduction, Edinburgh University Press and Georgetown University Press, 2001. Endangered Languages, an Introduction, Cambridge University Press, 2015. Chinook Jargon in Aerial and Historical Context Language, 1983. Genetic Relationship and the Case of Maya Bogo, studies in African Linguistics, 1983. Before the Lingua Franca, Pidgin Arabic in the 11th century AD with Alajibai Lingua, 1986. Truncation in Montana Salish with Lucy Thomason, 2004. Language Contact and Deliberate Change, Journal of Linguistic Context, 2007. The Pacific Northwest Linguistic Area Historical Perspective, 2015. Do you remember your previous life's language in your present incarnation? American Speech, 1984, and At a Loss for Words, Natural History Magazine, December 2007 and January 2008. She was the editor of Language from 1988 to 1994. In 2000, she was the president for the Society for the Study of Indigenous Languages of the America. And in 2009, she was the president of the Linguistic Society of America. Sara was chair of the Linguistics and Language Sciences section of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1996 and the secretary of the section 2000 to 2005. She has served on various Linguistic Society of America committees as an elected member of the Executive Committee 2001 to 2003 and taught at 5 summer LSA Linguistic Institute as the Harman and Clara H. College professor in 1999. The 2013 Linguistic Institute at the University of Michigan was dedicated to her. She is a fellow of the Linguistic Society of America and of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In October 2012, Yale University Graduate School Alumni Association awarded her the Wilbur Lucius Cross Medal, which is presented annually to a small number of outstanding alumni in recognition of distinguished achievements. This was her introduction. Now over to you, Dr. Sara, Professor Sara.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Turab. And I'm very glad to be here. I'm going to be sharing my screen so that you can see. Can you all see my slides now? Can you see that slide?
Yes, yes, yes.
And I'm doing that because I talk fast. So the text will be in front of you in case I talk so fast that you can't follow. I try to talk slowly, but it doesn't work. I want to start by thanking Turab and the Society for Endangered and Lesser Known Languages Pakistan for inviting me to give this talk. I wish I could be there in person. I've never been to Pakistan, but my father grew up there, so I've always been curious about the country. I am, let's see, I was going to say good morning because it's a little after 8 o'clock in the morning where I am in Montana in the United States, but I should say good evening because that's what it is where you are. So here's the outline of what I'm going to say today. I will try to get through it all. Turab said I should talk for no less than an hour and no more than an hour and a half. It will certainly fit an hour and a half, but I'm hoping to be quicker than that. After some preliminary comments, I want to talk in some detail about fieldwork, doing fieldwork on endangered languages, and in particular, how that kind of fieldwork differs from fieldwork on non-endangered languages. I will spend some fair amount of time on 2 examples from my own personal experience in Yugoslavia when I was a graduate student working on a dissertation, the old Yugoslavia when it was a big country, and on the Flathead Reservation, Native American tribes, Salish and Kutlispe in Montana, and some final comments on revitalization. So I started preparing for this talk by looking at Pakistan and endangered languages. So the first things I'm going to say will be familiar to almost everybody here, although I see that there are a couple of people here from places like the Philippines and Accra. But those of you who are in Pakistan probably already know this, but I didn't. So I looked it up. According to UNESCO's Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, there are 26 endangered languages in Pakistan. And when I say endangered languages are almost everywhere, the only place they aren't is in Antarctica, where there's no permanent human population. Of the 26 in Pakistan, 7 of them are in the vulnerable category in UNESCO's scale. That's languages that are not yet actually endangered, but they look like they're heading that way. The vulnerable languages include Brahui and Burushaski, which are the only 2 languages of Pakistan that I know anything about. Burushaski is a famous isolate, and Brahui is the northernmost Dravidian language. There are 13 languages that are definitely endangered and 6 that are severely endangered. Almost all of Pakistan's endangered languages belong to the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European language family, and the vast majority of them are in the Indo-Aryan sub-branch of that group. The exceptions are 4 Tibetic languages. Most of them are just vulnerable, and some of them are mostly spoken in other countries. That is, there are endangered languages of Pakistan that are the cross-national boundaries. There's 1 Dravidian language, that's Brahui, and 1 isolate, Burushaski. One interesting thing I noticed about Pakistan's endangered languages is that 14 of them are Dardic languages. And 5 of the 6 severely endangered languages of Pakistan are Dardic. That's interesting because the Dardic group of Indo-Aryan contains only about 24 languages. So if all the Dardic languages of Pakistan should vanish, the Dardic group will be greatly diminished. Somebody asked in a comment already in the chat on this site, the Zoom meeting, whether Shina was endangered. As far as I can tell from what I was reading on the internet, Shina itself is not endangered, but very closely related languages that are in the Shina group are. And my notes don't say which ones those are, but they would be among the Dardic languages. So obviously, almost all the people here at this meeting know a lot more than I do about the endangered languages of Pakistan. So I'm only commenting on these just to set the stage for a discussion of fieldwork, because given the introductory comments that the 2 of you made, Turab and Professor Aker, I didn't hear her name, I'm sorry. There is an increasing amount of work on endangered languages in Pakistan, and that will surely involve fieldwork. My own experience with fieldwork, as I say, has been in Eastern Europe, in the old Yugoslavia, and in Montana. Some of what I've learned, probably not all of it, will be relevant, useful for those of you who are engaged in fieldwork in Pakistan or who might be engaged in fieldwork later, and I will get back to that. So, doing fieldwork on an endangered language. If a language is severely endangered, it's typical that most of the remaining speakers won't have much opportunity to speak their language any longer. And when you're doing the fieldwork, a lot of what you're doing is trying to get people to retrieve memories of when they did speak the language regularly. With the people I work with in Montana, that might have been decades ago, 50 years ago in some cases. Some people are better than others at thinking back. There's no perfect consultant for anybody at any time, of course. But that's the goal. Suppose you want to begin field work on endangered language, actually on any language, but it's very important not to annoy the people you want to talk to, or they won't be willing to talk to you. So the first thing you need to do is get permission to do the work in the community you want to work in, from whatever authorities there are. In the old Yugoslavia, that would be a communist official. Each village had one. In Montana, it's a tribal council or an elders council. Whatever authorities there are, you want to tell them, this is what I want to do. I'm coming into your community. May I have your permission to do this? In some cases, communities will want a written protocol to lay out specifically what you can and cannot do with the data you collect. An example, I don't have a written protocol with the people in Montana, but I don't publish anything on the language until I have the permission of the Culture Committee and their Council of Elders. So those first two steps are likely to be especially important if the language is really severely endangered, because village authorities often will feel protective toward their elders. And those are the people you want to talk to. And they might not want outsiders pestering the elders who speak the language. Oops, sorry. When you're working with language consultants, the most vital thing is to show them respect at all times. You don't argue with them, you don't disagree. You need them a lot more than they need you. They can always fail to show up at the next meeting you've scheduled, or they might refuse to schedule a meeting with you if you offend them. In Yugoslavia, I found that men in the village would not answer my questions, but women would, so I tended to avoid being around the men. At one point, I was doing dialect research near the Albanian border in Yugoslavia, and the woman I was trying to talk to thought I was from the secret police, and she didn't want to say anything at all negative. I said, what do you call somebody if he's got a big nose and you don't like him? And she said, God gave him a big nose. It is not for me to criticize. I didn't get much data there. In Montana, the elders tell stories. They say their grandfather met Bigfoot in the woods. I don't know if you all have heard of Bigfoot. You might have heard of the Yeti in the Himalayas. But Bigfoot is a mythical humanoid, huge giant. But I don't argue with them. I don't think their grandfather probably did make Bigfoot in the woods, but I don't argue. They believe that dinosaurs and people lived at the same time. I don't argue about that. I don't tell them about evolution and mass extinctions. More interestingly, they'll say, so I'm getting a lot of weird noise. Are you getting weird noise?
Yes, everyone should mute their mic, please.
But you can hear me, okay?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. It's interesting that people say, the elders tell me they can understand neighboring tribes' languages. This is again in Montana. They say we can understand the Spokanes, we can understand the Kalispels, surprise, dialects of the language is Salish Lispe. They say we can understand the Calvilles. That's still not surprising because that's a closely related language. But they also say, and we can understand the Nez Perce. And that can't be true unless they're bilingual, because Nez Perce is a language that's totally unrelated to the Salishan languages as far as anybody knows. But again, I'm not going to argue with them. And I don't know why they think they can understand Nez Perce. It has to be either because they're bilingual, maybe in Nez Perce speakers, some of them, these are old allies, maybe they learned some Salish Kletlispe, and so they speak it with a Nez Perce accent, and the Salish Kletlispe elders think it was Nez Perce. I don't know. And I'll never find out because you don't argue with your consultants. For fieldwork on a non-endangered language, learning to speak the language really is the gold standard. Textbooks recommend it for any field worker who can possibly manage it. But with an endangered language, it might not be appropriate. It might not even be possible. So why? Because actually a couple of reasons. In Yugoslavia, my fieldwork was on non-standard dialects, but the only dialect I spoke, excuse me, was standard Serbo-Croatian. So anyone who had any exposure to the standard language would try to speak it to me. This was not helpful because I wanted to do dialect research and I wanted them to speak their own dialect. But if I had tried to speak their dialect, it would have sounded as if I were making fun of them. And think about that. In most countries where there's a standard official language, not that English is a standard in the United States, but close enough. Sorry, standard, but not official. Where there's an official language, there's usually a standard dialect, and non-standard speakers are considered uneducated and often stigmatized. So if you try to speak the way they're talking to them, they'll think you're making fun of them. This wasn't a major problem for me in Yugoslavia in the 60s because there were consultants. I found it pretty easy to find consultants who were old enough that they had never gone to school, but young enough that they were still sharp-witted and willing to work with me. The situation was somewhat different in Montana because it has been so long since people spoke Salish in families and every day. They speak their language very rarely. In fact, they told me some years ago that the only time they get to speak it nowadays was when they were working with me every week at the Culture Center. And occasionally during elders meetings the rest of the year, because I'm in the summer. So they don't expect other people, either younger tribal members or outsiders, to speak the language. And when I learned enough so that I could understand some of the jokes they were telling around the table, it made them nervous. They said, oh, we better watch what we say. So I stopped laughing at their jokes. You can't learn to speak a language without practicing it, as you all know. And I've had no practice, so I can't speak the language, but it wouldn't really be appropriate for me to do so. Actually, I think this has changed or is changing to a considerable extent because most of those elders are now gone, but I'll talk about that a little later. It's a similar example with more serious consequences. A field worker told me that he was working on a language in Mexico, and he worked very hard to learn to speak the language. He tried and tried, and he finally got fluent. And then the people he was working with said, so you were okay when you couldn't speak our language, but now you can speak it and we don't trust you any longer. And this had very serious long-term consequences for his relations with the community and for his fieldwork project. So the moral is, if you're going to do fieldwork and you're interested in learning to speak the language, make sure that the people want you to speak it. Again, there's advice in the literature. There are now quite a few textbooks on, well, several textbooks anyway, on field linguistics, how to do field work. And they have advice on selecting a consultant. This particular example or set of recommendations is from a book by Sackle and Everett in 2012. So you want a good storyteller, somebody who's friendly, speaks the dialect you're interested in, native speaker of the language, doesn't have a speech impediment, is able to reflect on the language as a formal system, and is well integrated into the community, well respected. Well, if you're working on an endangered language, particularly a severely endangered one, there's no point in trying to follow these criteria in effect, because you won't be able to. You'll be lucky to find a few people who are able to work with you and willing to do so. The main criteria you want are fluency, and even that isn't always available, and ability and willingness to work with you. I found that different people have different skills, and this is all from my work on Salish, where there are very few fluent speakers. Many years ago, I was working with two elders who were very, very patient about going over tape recorded stories that the tribe had recorded a couple of decades earlier. And they would go over them sentence by sentence to help me transcribe them. It was poor quality tape, so it was hard to hear. But they didn't tell stories of their own, so I couldn't get any new stories from them. Another example, I worked with two elders who had very clear pharyngeal consonants. These are rare in the world's languages, and the fact that Salishan languages have them is interesting. They sound like and and and. But one of those elders had such very soft glottalization, so pa versus that I could hardly hear it. It was very hard to hear. So they were great for pharyngeals. They weren't so good for glottalization. There was an elder who used to come very occasionally to our sessions, who was wonderful at explaining meaning differences, very subtle differences between words that seemed like synonyms. But he wasn't really interested in working hard and providing a lot of data. He rarely volunteered forms. Another elder was a real workhorse, even in old age. He was willing and able to work long hours without a break. But he was so dominant in our sessions. He was a tribal leader. The other elders couldn't contribute much, so I basically only heard from him, which was fine. But the one reason for working with a group of elders is that you get different opinions and different things from different people. Reliability is an issue, again, with a severely endangered language where the number of people available to work with you is likely to be very small. In Montana, the huckleberries may be ripe, and then the elders are going to be out picking huckleberries, not working with me. There might be a funeral to go to or a doctor appointment. And if all your consultants are elderly, some of them will get sick. The 90-year-old I mentioned almost died once when he was scheduled to meet with me, and he had a health crisis the night before, and he didn't want to miss our meeting the next day, and he refused to go to the hospital. I think they dragged him to the hospital, so they saved his life. He did miss that session. But the point is, consultants are not always there when you hope they will be. And that means that if you're a person who suffers from time anxiety, you just have to suppress it. You can't expect things to happen on a tight schedule because they will not happen on a tight schedule. And you expect and you get a lot of individual variation. I've learned to avoid the temptation to choose the best variant and throw out the others. Correct versus incorrect, you might not be able to tell because speakers will have different views. And speaker variation may not correlate with any obvious dialect divisions. So basically, it's a good idea to keep all the variants you've got within reason and look for patterns in the chaos. The only one of, I've given a couple of examples here, the only one that might possibly be a dialect difference are the words for cup. It's possible that Sunsu is only in Salish and that little bo is only in Petlispe, but I'm not even sure about that. And of course, cups are late introduced items after white contact with the Indians. This raises the question of anonymity in the United States. To do any field work with what the institution calls human subjects, you need the permission of the Institutional Review Board. And one thing the Institutional Review Board insists on is that you not identify the people you've worked with. But if there are only a few fluent speakers of the language you're working on, it's really important to know who said what if you want to understand the lexicon and structure. The way to get around this, if you have institutional review boards in the country you're working in, is to get everybody's permission to identify people, at least by their initials, for at least some of the utterances so that you can try to sort out the variation and find the patterns. I've always found that it is good to work with a group of people. They can talk to each other. As I said, this is one of the only times they have to speak their language. They can jog each other's memory. It helps people remember things. You get both men's and women's perspective. And working with just one person at a time, you lose all that. You always need to have questions, things you want to ask for prepared in advance. If you come without a script, figuring you will just think of things to ask as you go along, you'll waste a lot of time. It's fine for the people you're working with to think of things as you go along, but you need to be ready to fill whatever time you have. But you also need to set a leisurely pace. You don't want to rush through things. You don't want it to be too intensive. You don't want to tire people out. With an endangered language, you're likely to be working with elderly people who need breaks, and you need a break. If you miss things, if you get too tired, you'll miss things. Data collection techniques, maybe even more important with endangered languages than with non-endangered languages, although In this case, the differences are not so great between the two kinds of settings. Elicitation, how do you say horse in your language? That's always where you start, because you don't have any place else to start. You can't just take a text and assume you can figure out what it says if you don't know anything about the language yet. So you can get words, paradigms, sentence types, and so forth. So at the beginning of a field project, that's mainly what you're going to be doing. But there are things you'll miss when you're working with fluent bilinguals. First of all, because they might be rare, but also because if you're speaking a language both you and the consultant know, but it's not the consultant's language, then there's the danger the consultant will adjust their language toward the one you're talking to them in. If you're dealing with bilingual consultants. One time, this only happened once, I was trying to figure out how ditransitives worked in SELP, and I was working with a 98-year-old speaker, the oldest speaker at the time. And I wanted sentences that, like Johnny stole huckleberries from Mary. Huckleberries, by the way, are sort of like blueberries. They grow wild in Montana and the Northwest in general. They're wonderful berries. And Joe Aeneas kept giving me sentences like the first one here, Choni nak madli, which literally means Johnny steal, there's an oblique marker, huckleberries from Mary. It's a perfectly grammatical sentence, but in isolation, it's bizarre, pragmatically bizarre. Nobody would ever say that. And I knew nobody would ever say that. I knew enough to know that. But I also had been taught way back in graduate school that you never, ever push your consultant in some direction or another, because then you distort the data. But finally, after I kept getting sentences like Choni nak mali, I couldn't stand it any longer. And I said, Joe, I said, aren't these sentences kind of Englishy? And he was very surprised. He looked at me and said, well, yes. He said, you were asking in English. I thought that's what you wanted. Okay, I said, so how would you say Johnny stole huckleberries from Mary naturally in your language? Oh, well, he said, then I'd say, that's a very different sentence. You've got the same root for steal, but then you've got all sorts of transitive apparatus because this is a highly inflected language. So that's one pitfall when you're working with fluent bilinguals. And as I say, another pitfall with elicitation is that some grammatical features are so very rare that speakers can't easily produce them on demand. To get around that problem with a particular first plural agent and second plural patient and vice versa, I made up a story about two sets of people. And the young men were trying to impress the young women. And I got a lot of examples like we'll cook for you guys. Other techniques are quasi-elicited texts, like how to prepare a deer hide or how to bake camas, where you're not asking for translations of English sentences, so you avoid that problem. But you are just saying prompts, like, so then what do you do after that? And then the gold standard in texts, the naturally occurring texts of all kinds of genres, stories, conversations, whatever. But you might not be able to get these, again, in a severely endangered language. To collect stories, you've got to have a storyteller. The last SELP elder I worked with who would tell stories died in 2001. That was a long time ago. There are tape recordings, that is on cassette tapes from 1975 of accomplished storytellers. But the tape quality is so poor that I need extra help, expert help to transcribe them. And the consultants I worked with most recently didn't really want to do that. And anyway, I could never get the stories, the winter stories, the kinds of stories that can only be told in the winter, because I'm only there in the summer, because in the winter I was in Michigan teaching my classes. Suppose you're starting from absolute scratch. First, you're going to get some basic words, some morphological paradigms, some sentence types. You're going to work out the phonological system, a template for word structure if you've got a lot of affixes on words, verbs and nouns, and a general overall picture of the grammar. And if possible, you want to find out what the community wants you to work on and work on that. In the United States, at least, and I think this is changing all over the world, it's no longer considered ethical for linguists or anthropologists to march into a community and get a lot of data and leave and not do anything for the community. You're expected to give back to the community. And unless you're under a lot of time pressure or have a very specific project for some reason, you want to work with the community on what they want you to work on. So let me fill in a little detail, little more detail on field techniques by giving an example for dictionary making. First, you're going to get words as short as possible for initial phonetic and phonological analysis and for morphological elicitation. Later on, you want to get lexical data for compiling a dictionary and documentation of culturally interesting things. So how do you think of words to ask for? You start with a list of basic vocabulary. In the United States, at least, we use a Swadesh list. It's a list of basic vocabulary developed by American linguist named Morris Swadesh many decades ago. There's nothing magical about it, but it gets you a sizable stock of fairly short words. And you don't worry about the details of the list. So basically you want a lot of words. So the speakers will offer you different words for the same thing. You take all of them. A lot of languages, for instance, have no general term for brother, but they'll have younger brother in Salish that's Sinset, and older brother, Keos. So you get both of those. Or the language might have several words for horse, as Salish does, and so you get all of them, since Saska and Tsin. The reason a horse is something that bites is that they bite grass. And when people don't know a translation of an English word, you just go on to the next word. You don't worry about that. And you make use of all the sources you've got available for, and the techniques for getting more lexical data. You can go by semantic fields with direct elicitation, have the elders think of all the body part terms they can think of, all the kinship terms, things like that. But in a severely endangered language, some semantic domains are already going to be partly lost, very likely. I have never worked with an elder. I don't know if there were any when I started working on Salish Kutlispe back in 1981, but I've never worked with an elder who knew a lot about the animals and plants, medicinal plants, particularly. So I'm missing a lot of those. I know I'm missing a lot of them, but there's nothing I can do about it because I don't have any knowledgeable people to work with on that. And direct elicitation can get you to interesting things like sound symbolic words. I first came across some of these and then I asked for more. Is the sound of a cow pie plopping, that is a cow pooping. The creaking sound a tree makes when it's starting to fall, and little shiny things sparkling like stars winking, or sequins on a jingle dress. Jingle dress is a fancy dress worn at an annual powwow dance contest. And then you ask open-ended follow-up questions. So when I was getting the sound and sight words, I said, so are there any that I haven't asked for yet? And then they might say, well, there's E little, which is a bunch of things going in and out of sight. And you get a lot of data that way. Naturally occurring data, of course, is wonderful for storytelling and reminiscences of old activities and so forth, because they're going to be, of course, thousands of words that you will not get from elicitation. You won't think to ask for them. Your content consultants won't think to mention them. That means you can't compile an adequate dictionary by just collecting words. You have to collect texts as well. Constructed texts help, and as I said, I've used both. And you can try to elicit words found in published sources on the same language or on related languages, or languages that are at least nearby, so that the environment is similar. For my work in Montana, I've used dictionaries of closely related languages. But my most useful source by far is a dictionary produced by Jesuit missionaries back in the 19th century. It's a 2-volume dictionary, 1,000 pages. It calls the language Kalispel, that would be Kalispe. There's an appendix with verb conjugations. There's all sorts of material in it. But it's very hard to use. The orthography is under-differentiated. This is not surprising. 19th century people were not skilled phoneticians, or at least they weren't trained phoneticians in general. So a spelling KO could represent either a glottalized K or a uvular K or a glottalized uvular K. And you can't tell except by comparing words with the modern language to try to connect modern words with the old words. Some forms, some kinds of constructions are now very rare, and there may be errors. The priests who put that dictionary together were quite fluent, but they were not native speakers. So a lot of what I did the past 15 or 20 years was re-eliciting material from that dictionary. And it would go like this. So they called the dictionary the Father's Dictionary because the Jesuits were priests. They said, so I'd say, so the Father's Dictionary has a word spelled chinchemich. I join my hands together to receive something. Do you have that word? Well, they said, no, never heard of that. I said, well, how would you say that? And they said, well, you could say chintichstum, like you open your hands to receive something. Or I'd say, Father Eschisti, he's exploring. Do you have that word? And they say, yeah, we've got Eschisti, but it means he goes into enemy country to scout. So you get new forms, you get new meanings for the forms in the Jesuit dictionary. And you encourage the elders to free associate. So I'd say the elders have eschatus, eyes could be screened off, and they'd say, no, I don't know that, but we've got institus, the opponent, like in a stick game. That's a traditional gambling game. Or the fathers have peus, a narrow hole, like a needle, like the eye of a needle. And they'd say, no, we say eus, the eye of a needle. But then we also have oops, that flat backside, and then they laugh. You have to be aware that you might run into verbal taboos. That's not necessarily bad. Sometimes they will not be concerned about that, but you have to be careful. Semantic domains can be very large. Sound symbolism, the one I already mentioned, I have 168 examples of sound symbolic words, and there must have been many, many more that I never did here. Or they can be very small, like ways of walking, standard, like stagger or stride or stroll, all sorts of different ways of walking. Beginning of a project, almost every word is new, but later on, free associating will get you a lot of repetition, and therefore it's a waste of your time and the elders' time. So you need to change your strategies as you go along. One final note on the 19th century dictionary and the culture. Often their words would trigger memories in the elders of old words that they hadn't heard for decades and maybe never used, but their grandparents used them. There was one word, Nyopioten, that the Jesuits translated, that was your hope, your help that someone gave you and you relied on. And one elder said, well, a priest would say that, so you'd rely on him for support. And another elder said, yeah, well, they said it before the priest too, like in the winter when they had something they relied on, their medicine or their sweats. So you get that. So obviously very few documentation and revitalization projects are going to have a resource as valuable as the 19th century Jesuit dictionary of Linguistic. But the techniques I've used in re-eliciting words from this old dictionary can also be used in other contexts to get, to expand your database of lexical and grammatical material. And in particular, for endangered languages, they're helpful to get consultants to remember things that they themselves used long ago or that they heard from their elders in the old days. And they'll often say that, oh yeah, I remember my grandma used to say that. I want to turn now to talking about my own personal experiences with fieldwork on endangered dialects and languages, not because I think you should all be interested in what I've been doing, but because I think my experiences hold some lessons in general for fieldwork on endangered languages. My career has been bracketed by documentation work, first on endangered dialects of the language then known as Serbo-Croatian when I was a graduate student, and on Linguistic for the past 40 summers. I spent a year, as I said, doing dissertation research and fieldwork in the former Yugoslavia in the mid-1960s on endangered dialects of Serbo-Croatian, which has now been transformed into 4 separate languages, Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and Montenegrin, each one spoken in its own country. But at that time, it was all one country. The dialects I studied are probably gone now. Even when I was there, younger people in the villages I visited already spoke standard Serbo-Croatian. They were no longer speaking the dialect. They had radio, they had television, they went to school, the dialects were dying. It wasn't a good dissertation. It was a very bad dissertation, in fact, but there were a few interesting bits. For instance, there was a suffix ulja, which was used to derive pejorative nouns for women and non-pejorative names of cows in certain dialects in Stokavian territory. So I had nosulja, a woman with a big ugly nose, glibulja, a filthy woman, but I also had brkulja, a dark colored cow, and sivulja, a gray cow. I have no cultural insights to offer by this combination, but I thought it was interesting. The fieldwork was not always easy. I signed in with the local communist official. Yugoslavia was a communist country at the time, and every village had a communist official. I had to find speakers who couldn't switch to standard Serbo-Croatian. In one case, I had to hide behind a stone fence to get access to a female speaker, waiting till her husband left the house so that I could go talk to his wife. Trying to convince that shepherdess on the hillside overlooking Albania that I wasn't from the Yugoslav secret police. And I learned things about cultural constraints on fieldwork. I could not interview men in any of the villages because it wasn't appropriate for women to question men. They would talk to me, men were happy to talk to me, but I couldn't ask them questions and expect an answer. A lot of villagers over the age of 60 had never attended school, so it was easy to find elderly women who spoke only a local dialect. But I had to do the interviewing without any men around because it also wasn't really appropriate for women to talk much, at least not to me, when men were present. I learned that I was not physically suitable for village life because I was too thin. And they kept feeding me. They were very kind, but one day they fed me 6 meals and I could hardly walk, much less do field work. And some of them were quite nervous about politics, which is why that shepherdess on the hillside within view of Albania refused to talk to me. I was told later that the fact that I was speaking the standard dialect would have made her think I was from the secret police. And as I already said, it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to try to speak any of the dialects I was studying. It was a very intense year in terms of the pace of the work. It was my first opportunity to do field work and my learning curve was steep, that made me better prepared when my next chance to do fieldwork came along. And that was when I started working on Linguistic, which I've done every summer since 1981. Until this summer, well, not counting last summer because the pandemic meant I wasn't doing any field work, but until this summer, we were mostly working together on compiling, me and the elders, compiling a dictionary and texts for the tribe's language program. But in the past 6 years, all the elders I've worked with have died. I mean, some died earlier, but the last group died, which is tragic. It means I can no longer collect more data. I'm not in contact with the very few remaining native speakers of the language. So instead, I've changed to working with teachers of the language because the tribes are working hard on revitalization. And the teachers are younger tribal members who are not native speakers, but they're pretty fluent. And what they want from me is explanations of how the language is working. I'm not teaching linguistics, but I'm using my linguistic analyses to help me help them understand how their language works. This is extremely satisfying. It's not like working with the elders and getting new data. Fieldwork in Montana has been a lot easier in most ways than fieldwork in the old Yugoslavia, partly because I knew more about fieldwork when I started, but partly because it was easy to find groups of elders to work with, and we had a good time. A lot of laughter, usually because I made mistakes. And I learned a lot about cultural constraints in this setting. First of all, the culture committee, Linguistic culture committee, didn't tell me what work would be useful for them. They were too polite. That meant I had to guess. So early on, I wrote some grammar lessons. Those disappeared entirely, although these young language teachers recently told me that they had seen a copy of the culture committee and found them useful. So I'm now revising them. I tried a dictionary. That got them going. They said, yes, we would like a dictionary. I tried analyzing texts and they said, yes, we would like those too. So I had to guess what to do. And I made a couple of wrong guesses before I started working on this huge dictionary project. Another thing, some texts discuss traditional religion. That is, before the people in these tribes are Catholic, just pretty universally. At least all the people I've worked with have been. And I found that the traditional religion, which at least some of them remember and experienced when they were young, talking about the religion makes people uncomfortable. So I need to avoid that. Some of the taboo words were connected to religion. Another thing is that you can't tell coyote stories and other myths. These are the major mythical sort of body of texts and stories. You can't tell them in the summer because if you do, snakes will get in your bed. So you have to wait till snakes go to sleep for the winter. This is a problem for me. I can only be in Montana in the summer, as I said, so I have never been able to get coyote stories or any other myths. They say it's never a good idea to talk about the grizzly bear. He won't like it and you'll be sorry because he will come after you. I discovered this because somebody had brought a grizzly bear hide into the culture committee, and I commented on how small the eyes were because it had the head stuffed, and they all looked very uncomfortable. And so we shouldn't really talk about grizzly bear. I learned that certain medicinal plants won't work if you publicize them. So maybe I shouldn't put those plant names and functions in the dictionary. This, of course, you can imagine the dilemma this presents me with. Linguistic does have taboo words, just as English does, and probably all other languages, but you can't predict what kinds of words will be taboo. The main taboos I've discovered have to do with traditional religion. There was a verb meaning suck, which turned out to have a particular meaning in a religious context, and it was like had to do with sucking a wound, and they really didn't want me to put that in the dictionary. And as I said before, as in the old Yugoslavia, for a different reason, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to speak the language I'm studying because it's an in-group language. This, I think, is changing. For one thing, hate it, but the elders are gone now who were concerned about this. But thanks to the revitalization program, there are more and more younger people who are learning the language. And so it's the old in-group has vanished and the new group is less exclusive. Here's a very brief introduction to the language and the last generation of native speakers of Salish Kutlispe. In some publications, I've called the language Montana Salish. It was originally known as Flathead for reasons that not by the people themselves, nobody knows why. But it's gravely endangered. There are now only a handful of fluent speakers and they're all very elderly. All the ones I've worked with were survivors of school systems in which they were beaten for speaking their language. Mostly these were Catholic boarding schools run by nuns and priests. There was one public school as well. I asked an elder I worked with for a long time once if she had taught her 5 children to speak her language. And she said, no, she said, I didn't want them to go through what I went through. And I said, if you had to do it all over again, would you do it differently? And she said, well, yes, I would, but it's too late now. That's the saddest thing. The Salish and the Kutlispe are 2 different tribes who share the Flathead Reservation with each other and with a band of Kootenays. Kootenai language is unrelated to the Salishan language family. The dialects are not differentiated as far as I have been able to discover. Maybe they used to be. And with Spokane and Kalispel, they make a whole language that's all one language, but different dialects in Spokane and Kalispel. The language itself has no name. There are 4 tribes, 3 reservations, 1 language. Salish Kutlispe is a southern interior language and belonging, member of that branch of the Salishan language family. It's the easternmost of the 23 languages in the family. Most Salishan languages are on or near the Pacific coast, or were. Some of them are already extinct. There are features of this language that are likely to be lost forever within the next 20 years or so. This may be reversed by the revitalization program. For the phonological features, I'm a bit skeptical because I don't think they're focusing on those. All 4 of the pharyngeal consonants, which aren't even spelled in their regular writing system, the and quite possibly the glottalized stops, affricates, and resonant consonants, yeah. Maybe the velar uvular opposition, the qu, and a very rare k, and the uvulars k, k. Some of the elaborate consonant clusters will probably disappear, and they are elaborate. And these are serious consonant clusters. A lot of subtle morphological contrasts, I think, are in danger. For instance, between the regular 3rd person transitive suffix s, as in tsu'untes, he hit him. And when I've called backgrounded agent forms in m, tsu'untem means he got hit or someone hit him or they hit him, but you're not saying who. There might be a switch from verb, object, subject to subject, verb, object, word order, because I've heard occasional elders do that, and I don't know what's happening with the young people. So the old order would have been Wichis Madli Chani for Johnny saw Mary. And that might be getting replaced by Chani Wichis Madli, which is more Englishy. So in conclusion, the Serbo-Croatian dialects that I studied in the 1960s probably vanished a long time ago, as I said. But vigorous revitalization efforts are underway, efforts to bring the Salish-Kutli-Spell language back to its people's lives. And crucially, and this is the main thing I want to say about revitalization, the revitalization efforts in these tribes are led by tribal members. I'm eager to help any way I can by providing data from all my field work, by explaining whatever the language teachers want me to explain as far as I can, because my knowledge is still limited. I realized a long time ago that I will need to live to be about 150 years old in order to understand this language really well. It's a wonderful language. But the Salish-Kutli-Spell situation exemplifies what I think is perhaps the most vital truth about revitalization and reclamation of a language that's no longer spoken. Namely, linguists cannot save languages, unless, of course, the linguist is a community member, because only the language community can rescue its language from endangerment or dormancy. There are probably still linguists out there who think they can go into a community and say, I'm going to save your language and document it, and then everything will be fine. But if the community isn't behind this effort, and in fact, if the community isn't leading it, the chances of success are non-existent. Linguists can help if they're invited to do so by the community. And in particular, documenting an endangered language can preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost forever. So I want to close with two quotations, one from a linguist perspective and the other from a community's perspective. First, something Nancy Dorian said. Nancy Dorian, as some of you may know, is one of the very first scholars to have worked intensively on the whole subject of endangerment. She worked with East Sutherland Gaelic, that's a Celtic language, dialect of the Celtic language, native to Scotland. She had been awarded the Linguistic Society of America's Kenneth Hale Award for Outstanding Scholarship, undertaken by a junior or senior scholar that documents a particular endangered or no longer spoken language or language family. And what she said on learning that she'd been given this award was, I'll try to merit the award by carrying on assembling from my notebooks the only collection of East Sutherland Gaelic verbal lore, proverbs and such that can ever appear, since almost none of it is known to the few remaining speakers. Dorian worked with the last generation of fluent native speakers of East Sutherland Gaelic, but by the time she was given this award in 2011, all those people were gone, just as all the elders I've worked with on Salish-Kutli-Spell are gone now. And talking to these younger teachers, when I've talked to the younger teachers on the reservation, I shouldn't be surprised, but I am surprised when I'm talking about a particular elder that I worked with for years. I said, oh, I never met him. I wish I'd known him. And I realized that my privilege in having known some of these people means a lot to them as well as to me. And finally, this is from the obituary of Robert Rankin, who was a Siouan. He specialized in Siouan, the study of Siouan languages like Dakota and the Great Plains of the United States. And this was his obituary in the Wichita Eagle newspaper in Kansas. From a tribal member of a Siouan tribe called Kaw, said if it wasn't for his work, that is Rankin's work, we wouldn't have our language. He single-handed preserved our language. You can't put a price on something like that. So communities, sometimes they want linguist help, sometimes they don't. When they do, and when a linguist is available, the linguist's help can be extremely valuable. It's not valuable for the linguist to try to take over the process of revitalization, but providing data and documentation that linguists can do and help with explaining the grammar. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful talk. Indeed, it was very informative. There are certain questions from our participants. The first question is from Harun Malkani. Let me read the question. Uh, he's saying that I have a question from Professor Sara. Uh, to what extent do aspects of oral culture, oral tradition, storytelling, telling kids fables, proverbs, songs, etc. play a role in the maintenance of endangered languages across generations of speakers?
That's a wonderful question. It won't surprise you to hear that the extent is great. I mean, if you can keep those oral traditions going, they are invaluable as providing cultural continuity. It's the loss of the oral traditions that helps to make it so very difficult to revitalize a language, and heaven knows to reclaim one that's already dormant with no speakers left. I said that the last storyteller I worked with died in 2001, but he was not a traditional storyteller. He told funny stories. Some of the traditional people did too, but he wasn't known as a storyteller. The last storytellers, I only met one of them, and only very briefly before he died. They were back in the 1970s. And that oral tradition, a couple of the stories from 1975, when the tribes had a grant from the federal government to record cultural information, and they recorded this master storyteller telling stories. Some of the stories he told clearly stretched back, I could tell, because he identified particular people to early in the 19th century. That is, obviously he wasn't that old, but he'd heard from his grandfather, heard from his grandfather, and so forth. And it's not just that the language is preserved in the oral traditions. It's the impact of the culture, which can't be replicated in print. Obviously, print is certainly better than nothing, but bringing young people into the oral tradition is such a huge motivator for the storytelling. Dissertation committee I was on in the anthropology department at the University of Michigan some years ago was studying a language in the upper Amazon, in Peru. And the language he was working on, there were still storytellers, but part of the tradition was being lost of participatory storytelling. So the old tradition was the storyteller would tell the story, and the audience would say yes, not just yes, yes, but they would encourage this, or they say yes, and then what does he do? So they would actually participate actively in the storytelling. And he said there were still people who could tell the stories, but the audience participation was gone for all the younger people. It was barely preserved for the oldest speakers. And he said you could see that loss distanced the younger people from the process of storytelling because the participation had been so crucial to it. I don't have a solution, but if you're working on an endangered language and the storytelling, the oral traditions are still active, helping to encourage anything that can be done by the community or the linguists to help encourage the continuation of those traditions, that's vital.
Thank you very much. Another question is from our next participant, Mahaknaz. She's saying that how we can save our under-resourced languages from extinction.
Wait, let's see, I'm looking, these are in the comments, aren't they?
Yeah.
Is this the one? How should we save our indigenous or under-resourced languages from vanishing? At it?
Yes.
Well, as I say, we linguists can't. We can talk to communities that are interested. I mean, if a community is not engaged in the process, if the community doesn't see a problem with the language vanishing, and there are certainly communities like that, then the language will go. I mean, there's nothing the linguist can do. The linguist can document it. And the grandchildren of the people in the community now who aren't interested in saving the language and revitalizing the language, their grandchildren might be interested. And if they're interested in the future, then documentation by the linguist can certainly contribute then to revitalizing the language. So the documentation is never a waste of time of an endangered language, obviously, not just from a linguist point of view, but from the community's point of view. But whether it's put to use by the community for revitalization or reclamation, that depends on the community. Linguists can certainly talk to communities and try to convince them that it's a valuable thing to do. But some communities probably won't be convinced. Peter Ladefoged used to talk about communities in Africa who that felt that, you know, they'd really rather switch to Swahili. He got some pushback on that, but he believed it, and it might have been true.
Thank you. Another question is from Sobia. She's saying, she's asking, is it necessary for the linguist to become 100% proficient in any endangered language before trying to save it? If not 100%, how much proficiency is required?
Well, I guess my first reaction to that is if you wait to work on documentation until you're fully proficient, you may run out of time before you ever get to work on the documentation. A linguist, I mean, the whole point of being a trained linguist in fieldwork is that you understand how to do fieldwork and you don't need to know anything about the language in order to start documenting it. If you're documenting a language and it is culturally appropriate for you to speak that language, and as I emphasized, that's not always culturally appropriate for an endangered language, maybe for other languages too, but I only know of examples from endangered languages. If it's appropriate to learn to speak it, then absolutely, you should do that. But it's amazing how much information you can compile and how much knowledge you can have about a language without being able to speak it at all. I mean, as I said, I've worked on Salish Kutlispe for 40 years now, always in the summer, and I know a lot about the language. I can put a sentence together, I can put grammatical sentences together, but I couldn't carry on a conversation because with no practice, I can't put a sentence together quickly. And you can't carry on a conversation if it takes you 5 minutes to produce one sentence. So fluency is terrific if you can achieve it, if it's culturally appropriate for you to be speaking the language. That's great, but you don't want to wait before starting your fieldwork. And I should say, I should have mentioned something about fieldwork in the United States and North America generally. Native American tribes have been exploited and oppressed by mainstream white American society for hundreds of years. Their land was stolen, they were killed, they were pushed out of their territory, and they have also had a history for at least the last 100 years or so of anthropologists and linguists, mentioned it before, coming into the community, getting a lot of data, going away, and from the community's point of view, getting rich on their data, on their language. And this has created in a lot of Native American tribes a considerable amount of hostility towards outsiders encroaching on their territory and moving in. that's why it is absolutely vital not only to get permission to work in these communities from the local authorities, the tribal authorities, but also to figure out how to give back to the community so you're not exploiting their data, exploiting their knowledge. And that's partly why I have been so very cautious in all the time I've worked with these tribes not to try to speak the language, not to be pushy, not to be the white person coming in and demanding things of them. I know other linguists who have become fluent in the languages they've worked on, mostly in Canada, not in the United States, but mostly not. So it depends on the kind of community, whether speaking the language is appropriate, and you need to find that out. And you won't find it out by saying, hey, is it okay for me to learn to speak your language? You might find that way, but quite likely you won't, because they might be polite and say yes, and they might not mean it. But it's something you need to find out before you do start learning to speak their language. But you definitely want to start working on documentation for an endangered language without waiting for fluency. Of course, I'm very opinionated on this. There are other opinions out there. I'm not claiming mine is the only one that's valuable, and mine is conditioned by my own experience, and everybody has different experiences too.
A question from Yusuf Khan. How can gathering knowledge of different dialects of a language protect the same endangered language?
This raises a really difficult question. The whole tension between endangered dialects and endangered languages is it's an immense problem, and there is no good solution. If you're going to revitalize a language, one thing in the modern world that's likely to be necessary, unless the oral traditions are so powerful that you can go with those alone, is standardization, is a written language, materials for people to read, for learners to read. And in order to have a written language, usually you need some level of standardization. And standardization usually means selecting variants, and typically selecting one dialect. With Scottish Gaelic, this had nothing to do with Nancy Dorian's work, which I mentioned, but there has been a serious problem with the selection, the efforts to expand literacy in Gaelic and the dialect choice, to the point where some elders said, well, we don't feel connected to the dialect you're using, so we'd rather just use English. Because again, all the people who speak Gaelic are bilingual in English, and at least last I heard they were. Maybe that's changed. I doubt it. And if their choice is between using a dialect that they don't feel connected to and English, they'd rather choose English. This, of course, is disastrous for efforts, or can be disastrous for efforts to revitalize any language. Dialects are, people are attached to dialects. People's identity is bound up in dialects as well as in languages. This is hard for a lot of people, maybe particularly in the United States, which has this monolingual ideology, to understand, because standard English is such a powerful force in the United States. People in some other countries won't find it so hard to understand. But obviously, choosing one dialect helps to preserve the language, as long as you can get enough people to accept that dialect as the language. It's also been a problem with another Celtic language besides Gaelic, with Breton in Brittany, where there are, and in Cornwall, in Cornish, I don't know what it is about Celtic, where there are competing standards, and different groups prefer this version and other groups prefer that version. And it's a little hard to get a coherent, cohesive program together. And that's not good for the prospects of successful revitalization. But it's not as if you can expect to succeed by telling people, forget your dialect, you've got to use this one or else, because they'll choose some other language. They'll choose the dominant language and they will abandon the minority language. I don't have a solution. I don't think there is any easy solution. With luck, at least in some of these contexts, a solution will emerge. Unfortunately, in some cases, it'll happen when the elders who are attached to the particular dialects die. And maybe the only people left are the ones who are going for the one dialect that's been chosen as the one to promote. Sorry, that's not a satisfactory answer. It is a serious problem.
Thank you. A question from Alamgir Mirza. How many years should we give during language documentation for the process of elicitation and re-elicitation?
How I didn't quite get that. How much emphasis on each?
How many? No. How many years we should give for language?
Oh, how many years?
For the process of elicitation and re-elicitation.
That one, there's no easy answer to, but at least it's not a danger sign for the revitalization project. It depends on the situation, clearly. In my Montana case, the fact that there is this 19th century dictionary with an incredibly rich body of material means that re-elicitation made sense. It produced huge amounts of useful data. But for elicitation, I have never stopped eliciting data. It's an ongoing process, but it's not as if you want to use one technique all the time and then switch and use another technique all the time and then switch to a third technique. You want to do them in parallel. One reason I've never stopped doing elicitation is that when I'm working with a group of elders, that's the easiest way to get lots of data. If I've got text to analyze, I can do that by myself. I don't need the elders. If I've got text that I have transcribed, I mean, as I said, transcribing the text is not easy if you've got poor quality recordings. But I have some texts that I've recorded myself and the quality of the recordings is better and I can transcribe them without help, or at least without much help. So analyzing text is something that can be done independently, and I do it independently of the sessions with the elders. When I'm with the elders, I mean, what I would like to have done, but never quite succeeded, would have been to encourage the elders to speak to each other, just to carry on conversations. But they were so unused to speaking their language. It was such a rare occasion that this didn't work very well. So what I have in my recordings is occasional bits of conversation. So that's not elicitation. But the sessions themselves, a lot of them, I mean, most of them continued to be elicitation. As I said, in the last years when I had elders available, re-elicitation of the Jesuit material. So I wouldn't put a number of years on it. It depends on the available resources among the people. I had a student who worked in Bolivia who was particularly interested in conversational data, and she spent her time in the field with her tape recorder or giving the tape recorder to a member of the community, actually recording conversations, and didn't sit with people and elicit. So it depends a lot on the situation. But the basic message is you never want to rely on just one technique for documentation. You need as many techniques as you can manage.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but the last question and a comment from Naeem. The comment from Naeem is that Shina is not an endangered language, but in the context of Pakistan, it is considered as regarded as endangered language. And the question is from Tanya Rahman. Tanya is asking, can family language policies be a way to save the endangered dialects, which cannot be chosen as the standard dialect?
Can you use, oh, the question of Shina, that's interesting that, I mean, UNESCO's Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger is as good as the information they've been given. And they are not, that means they have to rely on what people tell them. As far as I could tell by looking up all the 26 languages on the internet, as I said, there are some either variety. I couldn't tell if they were actually dialects of Shina or if they were very closely related Dardic languages. But it looked as if some of them, at least a couple of them, are endangered, which suggests that there's some varieties of Shina that are not, but I don't know. I wouldn't be at all surprised to find that, obviously, that Shina was endangered. Now I've forgotten the other question you asked. Can you save a dialect even if it's not the one chosen for standardization? Was that the question put up?
No, the question was, can family language policies be a way to save an endangered dialect?
Yes, yes, of course. I mean, it's a very common thing with minority languages in general, as you know, that the minority language is used in the home and the dominant language in the community is used outside the home for business purposes and work and other social circumstances. So if an endangered dialect continues to be the home language for, would have to be more than one family, but for a group of families, a community, a sub-community, a section of a city, yes, of course, it can continue. There may be situations where that's a stable, there may be contexts where that's a stable situation. The ones I've heard of are a little shaky because there's always the pressure from the dominant language, or in the case of an endangered language where a different dialect has been spoken, chosen as the standard, where the children are exposed to the standard dialect. I don't just offhand know of particular cases like that. I do know of cases with minority languages where some of the children in a family chose to shift to the dominant language, others stayed with the minority language. But the examples I've heard about in detail are cases like Spanish in Los Angeles in the United States. And not only is Spanish not endangered, but there's a lot of support for Spanish, particularly in the southwestern parts of the United States, because there are so many people who speak Spanish. So it's not a good, even there you have some children in the family switching to English and other children feeling that they want to preserve Spanish and teach it to their own children and so forth. And if that's hard with a non-endangered, pervasive in the community language like Spanish, I would think it would be even harder with an endangered dialect where the standard dialect is powerful and people are learning it in school and people are speaking it outside the home. I would think it would be hard to continue the non-standard dialect even in the home, but it could happen. I mean, the famous Indian example of the village of Kupwar, which again is not endangered dialects, but the languages are kept separate for interesting social purposes. And there really is what appears to be, although actually I've heard this is less stable than it seems in the literature, but the fairly stable maintenance of the different languages in the home, but outside the home, everybody's, well, they're not all speaking the same language outside the home either, but they're mostly speaking Urdu.
Thank you very much. A question from Yusuf Khan, that is someone working on any dialect in Pakistan. Yusuf Khan, if you join our family or society, that is Society for the Endangered Languages, our forum will provide you this answer, I think, because we have a lot of people who are working on endangered languages. We have a lot of scholars across Pakistan who are working in this area. And sorry, we have so many questions, but we are running out of time. So thank you, Dr. Thomason, for your enlightening talk. And I'm also thankful to all the participants. Special thanks to Gift University, who their forum provided us a platform, that is Zoom, a user-friendly platform. Thanks to Dr. Saima Aziz and Aruj for their coordination. And also thanks to Dr. Asir Ajmal, Dean of Social Sciences, Gift University, Gujaranwala. And a lot of participants are saying about e-certificates. Yes, e-certificates will be issued in a week or less than a week. And also the PPT slides will be shared by Sara with me, and I will share with all of you. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your interest in our webinar.
May I say one more thing, Tura? Thank you.
Yes.
Also, I see there were a few other questions that we didn't get to. My email address is easy to find. If you Google my name at the University of Michigan, you can find my email address. If you want to ask me a question, feel free. Email is better than Facebook.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you.